Welcome to the College of Education 10-Minute Research Break, a podcast devoted to highlighting research by Illinois State University's College of Education, faculty, staff, and students. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and take a break with us.
Hello, I'm Tricia Class. Today I'm talking with Dr. Yun-Ching Chung, faculty in the Special Education Department. Her focus is in the area of intellectual disabilities. The article that we will discuss focuses on social interactions of students with disabilities who use augmentative or alternative communication in the classroom. Welcome, Yun.
Thanks for having me, Tricia.
Talk about the importance of peer interaction for students with disabilities. Can you discuss what the research has found about its importance and the barriers or problems for students with developmental disabilities?
Sure. As educators, we all know how important it is for students, just simply for a child or a teenager to make a friend, or just simply have a social connection with others. So if you ask a high school student, so what he or she most looks forward on a typical school day, the answer you will get probably is not, oh, I'm going to look forward to the math class or science. The answer you're getting is probably, I really look forward to the time I get to spend with my friend. And research has shown that students with positive peer relationship are more likely to be successful in their better post-school education outcome. But however, for students with developmental disabilities, such as students with autism or intellectual disabilities, they often have difficulties developing peer relationships. In the special education elementary school longitudinal study, so parents report that 17% of the children with intellectual disabilities and 32% of the children with autism had never visited with friends during the previous year. And 50% of the children with intellectual disabilities and 80% of the students with autism never or rarely receive telephone calls from friends. So as you can see, social isolation might be apparent for students who use AAC. So AAC refers to augmentative and alternative communication. And usually, AAC are used to support a student who have a limited speech. And different type of AAC system include facial expressions, gestures, sign language, pictures, electronic devices, or communication apps on iPad, iPod Touch. So for students who use AAC, there are a range of barriers to peer interaction. On the other hand, their classmates might not know how to interact with them. Although researchers have identified these potential barriers, but we know very little about naturally occurring social interactions among students who use AAC and their peers without disabilities. So that's the reason we want to do this observational study.
You and your co-authors selected a very detailed recording system and a method to assure reliable data collection. Can you summarize or describe some of the procedures you used?
Sure. For each student, we observe them 4 times. Basically, we use a paper and pencil method in combining interval and event recording systems. So we use momentary time sampling to record contextual variables in the classrooms. As you can see, we divide the entire observation into 1-minute interval. At the beginning of 1-minute interval, we look at the student and we record what kind of instructional format the student was receiving. And we do not proximity to peers, to their support personnel, to their AAC devices, or to general education teachers. For student social interactions, we use partial interval recording and event recording. So basically, we record whether or not an interaction occurred any time of interval. We were interested in the nature of the social interactions. So for each interaction episode, we also collect information on the communication modes the student used, the communication partners involved, and if a student initiates an interaction, we record a function of the communication. If someone else initiates an interaction, we will code the communication opportunity that was provided to the student. As you can see, these are definitely quite a complicated system we had.
You had findings relating to 3 main areas, and I thought you could talk about each of those 3 main areas.
Sure. First, we found out about 2/3 of the time students had interaction with others, so which is good. They were interacting in the classroom most of the time. However, 90% of the interaction episodes were exclusively with adults, usually their support personnel. So we are talking about paraprofessionals or special education teachers. And about 5% of the social interactions were exclusively with peers, and about 5% of interaction episodes involve both peers and adults. And also we found out students only initiate about 15% of interaction episodes. And less than half of the interaction episodes were reciprocal. I mean, somebody initiate and the students always respond. Or when the students initiate and somebody always respond. That's how we define reciprocal interaction. The most frequent communication modes used by students to interact were facial expressions, gestures, and vocalizations. And students rarely use the AAC devices. And when the students will use AAC initiate, the function usually involves requesting wants and needs. And when others initiate toward the student with disabilities, they most often provide instructions or make comments. And second, the interaction episode will fairly consistent across instructional formats. So it's not necessarily a student will get more interaction in large or small groups, so we're fairly consistent. However, we were quite surprised. We found out students actually were gone from the classroom about almost like 20% of the class period. And so think about they either arrived at class late or they left early. And so this is definitely something we did not expect, but we just found out from observation. So when the students were in the classroom, they were in the proximity to peers about 60% of the time, but their AAC devices were only in proximity about 40% of the time. Last, so when students with disability initiate to their peers, and they usually try to develop social closeness. On the other hand, when they initiate to adults, the most frequent function was usually like wants and needs.
From these findings, you had 5 major conclusions, but could you discuss 1 or 2 of them that you think have the most impact for success for students with disabilities?
Sure. I believe our most significant finding is for students with developmental disability who use AAC, peer interactions often do not occur naturally in the general education classroom. So I think this is definitely the key message. Although peers were in proximity over half the observational time, and students with disability almost exclusively interact with the staff person assigned to them. And unfortunately, we did see 3 out of the 16 students we observed did not have any peer interactions at all during the observations. And one explanation for such adult-oriented interactions is that the typical service delivery model used to support students with severe disability in an inclusive classroom. So the majority of participants in this study received one-to-one support from paraprofessionals. Although frequent interactions with adults are to be expected within these instructional models, but we were somewhat shocked by the lack of peer interaction despite the students' presence in an inclusive classroom. So although research indicates that paraprofessional can be taught, facilitated strategies for increasing classroom interactions among students with and without severe disability, but we definitely need additional research to systematically replicate and extend these strategies for use AAC. And second, although most of the students were reported to use some type of AAC system, they rarely use these devices in the classroom. Students primarily relied on facial expressions, gestures, and vocalizations during those classroom interactions. AAC devices were not in close proximity over half the observation. Anecdotally, we also observed that some devices were never brought to classroom. So either left in the backpacks, placed just out of reach of the student, or simply turned off. So the limited use of those devices could be also indication either students they just prefer to use other communication modes than the other. Although those facial expression gestures are easy to use, but they don't necessarily convey some of those message. So that's why I think we definitely need more research to look at potential barriers to use those communication devices in the classroom.
What are your own personal plans to follow up or extend this research?
I definitely want to continue this side of work in identifying the supports and strategies that can be used by teachers and paraprofessionals to better support the social participation of the students. And recently, I also collaborate with my colleague here at ISU, Dr. Julie Stoner. We just began a survey study. So the purpose of our survey project is to learn how students who use AAC are supported in the inclusive classroom. And we also want to learn a team perspective on needed training and support. Hopefully the information we learn from this survey will help us better prepare teacher candidates and identify professional development needs for supporting students with complex communication needs.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great talking to you.
The full citation for today's article is Chung, Carter, and Sisco, 2012, Social Interactions of Students with Disabilities Who Use Augmentative and Alternative Communication in Inclusive Classrooms, American Journal of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, Volume 117, Number 5, pages 349 to 367. Join us for future Research Break podcasts.
This podcast is sponsored by Illinois State University's College of Education, where we strive to assure that all students realize the democratic ideal through our teaching, research, and service to the field of education.